With less than 100 days before Election Day, democracy is on the docket in courthouses around the country. Welcome back to Defending Democracy. I'm Marc Elias.
And I'm Paige Moskowitz. Let's get started. Welcome back to our litigation lightning round. July was an incredibly busy month in the courts. Marc, let's start off by recapping some of the victories we saw.
All right, you pick a state and I'll give you the update.
Wisconsin.
Wisconsin was the busiest state for really important litigation in the month of July. And let's start with the state Supreme Court, which restored drop boxes for 2024. They were in place for 2020. Republicans went to a then conservative court, got them banned for 2022. But thanks to the good work of lawyers in my firm and elsewhere, they are back in place for people voting absentee in 2024. Okay, another big case in Wisconsin from out of the Court of Appeals. They rejected a Republican effort to get absentee ballots tossed out and not counted based on small variations in the address certification. Paige, think about that. In the address certification, what the hell do you even need a witness for, no less to fill out an address certification? But in any event, small variations in the address certification from witnesses, people witnessing other people's absentee ballots, that they lost that case. So good news for voters on both of those two in that instance. And another court in Wisconsin rejected a right-wing lawsuit to make voting harder this fall.
Marc, our next state is a duo. Actually, it's Mississippi and Nevada.
Okay, hold on. Can we give Mississippi its own shout out here? I mean, when have we ever talked about Mississippi? Okay, huge case out of Mississippi. The Republican National Committee out of Washington, D.C. sent their high-priced lawyers from Washington, D.C. down to Mississippi to try to stop the state of Mississippi from counting mail-in ballots that came in a day or two after election, but were mailed by voters on or before Election Day. Why is that important? It is important because they don't care. Let's be clear. They don't care about Mississippi. Mississippi already has very bad voting laws. They were doing this because they were trying to create a precedent to then block, more than a dozen other states that have similar laws that allow it. One of those states, as you point out, Nevada, where they brought a separate lawsuit. But I want to give Mississippi its own thing here, right? So Mississippi, they lost. They also lost in Nevada, where Republicans and Donald Trump's campaign brought a lawsuit, right? The Trump campaign was in on this action in Nevada, and they lost a similar lawsuit in Nevada. This is part of an overall effort, Paige, that Democracy Docket has covered to try to bring these lawsuits around the country, all aimed at not counting, at throwing out otherwise lawful mail-in ballots that are sent by the voter before Election Day, but due to slow mail service, don't come in until a day or two afterwards.
We also saw a major victory for voting rights in Ohio.
Yeah. So look, the news out of Ohio is good news for a change. We were used to a lot of not great news out of the Ohio courts, but a federal judge struck down an Ohio law that limits who can help a disabled voter submit their mail-in ballot. You would think, Paige, this would be common sense, but of course the Republican Party, they litigate against common sense. So kudos to the disability groups that brought that case.
Marc, in July, we also saw 16 new voting rights lawsuits filed, the most out of any month this summer so far.
There were really, really important cases. The RNC and the Trump campaign filed a lawsuit to try to shut down voter registration at the VA, the Veterans Affairs Department, as well as the Small Business Administration in Michigan. They filed that lawsuit. The ACLU is suing Nebraska for refusing to register people with felony convictions as the state law requires. So they're actually violating their own state law, state where, by the way, they can pass the laws. And Republican officials and conservative groups are suing over Biden's executive order expanding voter registration opportunities. Paige, guess what? They brought that lawsuit in Texas. You want to guess what city in Texas?
Amarillo.
Amarillo. There you go.
Amarillo, the hottest city in Texas, weather-wise and litigation-wise. But Marc, let's get to our lightning round. I name a state. You tell us what decision you're waiting on.
That's the way I like it. I'm sitting here just waiting for you to give me a state.
Let's start in Arizona.
Arizona. We are waiting on a lot in Arizona, but the real place to keep your eyes on are the several lawsuits that have been filed by the Republican Party and their conservative allies targeting the election procedure manual. This is the document that basically tells election officials in Arizona how to conduct their elections. There is an all-out war by Republicans to try to strike down this basic foundational document because they want to make it harder to vote and easier to cheat. Georgia requiring a wet ink signature. That's right, your original hard copy signature in order to do things like get an absentee ballot or register to vote. It's crazy. We are like waiting on pins and needles every day for a decision. Michigan is a must-win state in 2024, and there are two cases right now that you got to pay attention to. The first, the Republican National Committee is in court suing over the voter rolls in that state. Anytime you hear Republicans or their allies suing over voter rolls, what do they really want? They want purges. They want to kick people off the rolls. So you got to watch that lawsuit. We're waiting on the outcome of a motion to dismiss. The second case, though, is part of a pattern we see nationally, which is that Republicans and their allies are bringing a lawsuit challenging a sensible rule by the Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson in Michigan, that puts limits on what Republican partisan poll observers, who are challengers, can do in the polling place. It doesn't say they can't be there, but it says, number one, there's a limit on who they can talk to, right? Because we don't want them interfering in the process. But number two, it says they can be kicked out if they are disrupting the voting process. Why do Republicans and their allies not want common sense rules that make sure there is decorum and a safe place to vote in the polling place? You know why, Paige.
Because they hate it when people vote. Marc, let's move on to Montana.
Yeah, Montana, critical case. We have seen a lot of really good, important cases decided by the courts in Montana. We saw voter suppression laws got kicked out. We saw the Secretary of State lose to try to prevent ballot initiatives from being on the ballot. But this case that I want you to focus on involves a very pernicious law that Republicans tried to pass last year that said, basically, if you are registered in one place and you register in Montana, you may be committing a crime if, wait for it, you didn't call your prior place of registration and cancel it, right? It's a voter intimidation / challenge law in sheep's clothing. Well, they lost this case at the trial court. They are now bringing it to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Oral argument is scheduled for August 14th. Follow Democracy Docket on social media and make sure you're subscribed to their free daily and weekly newsletters because they will be reporting on all of these cases, but in particular, this very important case in the Ninth Circuit on August 14th.
Returning to one of our favorite states, North Carolina.
Is it, though? Is North Carolina one of our favorite states? Look, I love North Carolina. I went to law school in North Carolina. We've talked a lot, Paige, over the years.
It keeps us busy.
It keeps us busy, right? We've talked a lot over the years. A lot of really important cases have come out of North Carolina. Supreme Court cases that we've had victories in have come out of North Carolina. But, the issue now with North Carolina is a legislature that keeps passing one voter suppression law after another. And we could talk about a lot of cases, but the one I want you to focus on right now is the photo ID law, the federal case. This is very similar to a law that was passed by North Carolina in 2013 and struck down by the Fourth Circuit for targeting Black voters with, quote, almost surgical precision. And, they're at it again. There was a state level lawsuit challenging the law. It got struck down, but the state Supreme Court then flipped. And so that got reinstated. So the hope of people trying to keep this photo ID law from going into effect is now in the federal courts, and you need to pay attention to it.
Another one of our favorite states, because we have ties to it, because it always keeps us busy, New York.
I'm a New Yorker. I'm a native New Yorker. I was born and raised in New York, Paige. And I, as you say, care a lot about what happens in New York, but everyone needs to care about what happens in New York because not only is it the greatest state, but it is also the state that will decide the outcome of control in the U.S. House of Representatives. It goes through New York, and Republicans have been filing lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit, trying to make it harder to vote in New York and strike down pro-voting measures passed by the legislature. The latest is a case that was just heard by the state's Court of Appeals, which is their highest court. I know it's a little confusing, the nomenclature, and it involves their mail-in voting law. And so we all need to be paying attention to that case. Ohio. Lots going on in Ohio. There is a voters' Bill of Rights ballot measure, not to be confused, by the way, with the pro-abortion ballot measure, which Republicans already have gotten their their butts handed to them over in court several times. But there is a voter Bill of Rights ballot measure that once again, the Republican state officials are trying to block, right? The state Supreme Court is going to have to decide if the Attorney General has to move the petition onto the next leg of the process, or if he can reject the petition language. I mean, I just feel like, Paige, every time we talk about Ohio, it is a good ballot initiative that is following the law, and it is Republican state officials, whether it's the AG or the Secretary of State, who are trying to block it. And the good news is the state courts, even though they may not be progressive, they have not been yielding to those conservative Republican state officials.
And this would be a major ballot measure. It proposes implementing same-day and election day voter registration, no excuse mail-in voting, automatic voter registration. So we're keeping a close eye on the status of this case and what will happen next for the ballot measure. But Marc, let's move down to Pennsylvania.
Yeah, Pennsylvania, Paige, it wouldn't be one of these lightning rounds without us talking about wrongly dated and undated ballots in Pennsylvania. That is now back up before the courts. There is a case that is before the state Supreme Court that it deals with a related issue, but may ultimately wind up bearing on this. There are federal court cases pending on this issue. There is, of course, the naked ballot issue, which is not yet entirely settled. This was a big issue in 2020. These are the ballots that go into the outer envelope without being inside an inner envelope. And we are waiting on a ruling whether Butler County should reject them or whether people should be allowed to cure them. Lots always going on in Pennsylvania. Wisconsin. So, we talked about voter roll challenges elsewhere. There's a voter roll challenge in Wisconsin, not surprisingly, by a right-wing outfit called PILF, and we are waiting on the outcome of a motion to dismiss in that case.
And finally, Minnesota.
Yeah, Minnesota. Conservatives there are challenging the restoration of 50,000 people's right to vote. Just think about that. That's what they're spending their time and money on, trying to prevent 50,000 people from having their rights restored. I have a high degree of confidence that the Minnesota courts are going to make short work of that effort.
Marc, while we're waiting on decisions in these cases and more, a federal court in Louisiana denied a preliminary injunction in a lawsuit challenging a new law there that limits who can help voters with disabilities fill out their ballot. The court there invoked the Purcell principle, said it was just too close to the election to change the law now. Give us an overview of what the Purcell principle is and if we'll be seeing more of it as we get closer to the election.
Yeah, the idea of the Purcell principle was once common sense, and now it is morphed into, frankly, something that is unrecognizable. The original idea of the Purcell doctrine or principle was that there are certain kinds of changes to election rules that courts shouldn't order too close to the election, right? You don't want them changing the rules at the very last minute because it makes it impossible to administer elections. It confuses voters. That was a sensible doctrine or a sensible principle. Over the last few years, a very conservative Supreme Court has issued some pretty, shall we say, questionable Purcell arguments in which they have done things like block new maps from coming into place so that black voters don't have to face discriminatory redistricting maps, or preventing the protection of voter rights under this doctrine. So unfortunately, we now kind of have an expansion of this doctrine so that it is now not a way of protecting voters and fair administration of elections, but it is essentially a way to freeze the status quo, even when that status quo is harder to administer election laws, even when that status quo means it is going to be harder for voters or less fair for voters. But it is something that we have to contend with every day. It is a federal court doctrine, and it is something that we all watch every time we see a case go to the U.S. Supreme Court. Thank you for watching this edition of Defending Democracy, our lightning round. Make sure you are subscribed to our free daily and weekly newsletters to stay informed on the latest voting rights and democracy news. Defending Democracy is a production of Democracy Docket LLC.